Chapter 12. Ambush. Less than 24 hours later, Fame was back at the frontier. Once again, his car was thoroughly searched, but once again, Rank and Silver found nothing. They didn't even find the scratch on Fame's car. Fame told them he'd covered it with paint. Fame left the frontier and drove towards Donna. He was in no hurry, and he decided to stop for a coffee on the way. He knew a small cafe nearby. Fame parked his car outside the cafe and went in. He ordered a coffee and sat down at a small table. A radio was playing, and Fame sat there listening to the music. The cafe was almost empty. The music on the radio stopped, and a voice started to read the news. Fame had been out of the country for a day. He was interested in what had happened while he'd been away. Suddenly, Fame sat up straight in his chair. The news on the radio was about Harker. The radio said that the police had just found the body of a man called Harker. Fame listened. The news said that Harker's body had been found in a hut in the forest. The police thought that Harker had been murdered. Fame finished his coffee quickly and left the cafe. So now Inspector Roland knew that Harker was dead. Dom was still a hostage, and now the inspector would be looking for Fame. Fame decided to drive straight to Zara's house. So he hurried over to his car, got in and drove off towards Donna. It was a beautiful day without a cloud in the sky. A slight wind moved the tops of the cypress trees along the straight white road. Fame began to forget his worries as he drove along under the cypress trees in the morning sun. Fame didn't notice that there was a big blue car behind him. The blue car followed Fame for about 1 kilometre along the road. Then, just before the road began to climb into the hills, the blue car pulled out and accelerated past Fame and disappeared round the bend in front. Fame saw the blue car go past him, but he was only half looking at the road. Above him, hanging in the sky, was a golden eagle. The eagle was hardly moving. Its wings were spread and still. Fame slowed the car down and watched. Suddenly the eagle dived towards the ground and disappeared behind the cypress trees. Then there was a scream of a small animal. The eagle had caught something, a hare perhaps, or a rat. Fame drove on. The road was now climbing and turning through the hills. On the other side of the hills was the valley and the lake and the town of Donna. Near the highest point of the road, Fame saw a sign at the side of the road as he came round a corner. The sign had one word written on it: slow. Fame slowed down. Someone must be working on the road, mending it. Fame couldn't see anybody. The ground on the left side of the road climbed steeply to some trees. On the right it fell steeply into the valley. The road itself was narrower than anywhere else between the frontier and Donna. Suddenly Fame heard a shot. There was a loud noise very close to him, and then another. Someone was shooting at Fame's car. Fame tried to accelerate, but the car was out of control. Fame tried to keep the car on the road, and bullets were hitting the car from all sides. Then there was a loud crack, and the windscreen broke into hundreds of pieces of glass. Fame could see nothing. Fame put the brakes on as hard as he could, and felt the car slide to the left, then to the right. Then the car turned a complete circle and stopped. Fame opened the door and ran. Then the shooting stopped. Fame jumped over the edge of the road and rolled down the slope. Over and over he went, until he reached the bottom. There were some bushes at the bottom of the slope, and Fame pulled himself into the middle of them. He lay there, breathing heavily. From above him, Fame heard a voice. It was Ezra's voice. "All right, Fame! We've got you!" shouted Ezra. "Come out of those bushes with your hands up!" Another journey. Fame got up, put his hands above his head, and came out of the bushes. He looked up. Ezra was looking down at him from the top of the slope. Next to Ezra was the bald-headed waiter with the scar. There were also 2 other men. Fame and Zara had seen these 2 men at the lakeside restaurant. One was tall and dark, The other was short and fat.
"Well, Fame," said Ezra. "Nice to see you again."
Fame said nothing.
"Go down and search him, boys," said Ezra.
The tall dark man and the short fat man came down the slope towards Fame, while the bald-headed man pointed his gun at him. Fame kept his hands up while the two men searched his pockets.
"He hasn't got a gun, boss,"
said the tall dark man. Fame recognized the voice. He'd heard it somewhere. It was a high voice with an Italian accent.
"Okay, Guido," said Ezra. "Tie his hands."
Guido took a piece of rope from his jacket pocket and tied Fame's hands behind his back. Then he and the fat man pushed Fame back up the slope towards the road. Fame's car was right in the middle of the road. Broken glass from the windscreen lay all around the car, and one of the tires was flat.
"Skull," said Ezra to the bald man. "You stay with his car, change the wheel and knock out the rest of the glass, then follow us."
"Right, boss,"
said Skull. Ezra turned to Fame.
"You're coming along with us," he said. "I've got a few things to ask you."
Ezra turned and crossed the road. Guido and the fat man pushed Fame along behind him. Ezra walked a little way up the white road, and then turned off down a lane. The branches of the trees hung low, shutting out the sun and making the lane dark. A big blue car was parked there. Fame recognized it. It was the car that had passed him earlier while he was watching the eagle.
"Put him in the back, Robert,"
said Ezra to the short fat man. Robert pushed Fame into the back of the car. Then Robert sat on one side of Fame and Guido sat on the other side. Ezra got into the driver's seat and started the car. The car moved slowly forward down the dark lane under the low-hanging trees to the main road. Ezra turned left and drove towards Donna. Looking back, Fame saw that Skull had got his car to the side of the road and was changing the wheel. They drove steadily towards Donna. Ezra didn't seem in a hurry. A few miles out of Donna, Ezra turned onto a small road. Fame knew this road. It also led into Donna. There was less chance of meeting any police cars on this road.
"Well, Fame,"
Ezra said after a few minutes,
"so you and I are enemies now."
Fame said nothing.
"And Harker's dead," said Ezra.
"So I heard on the radio," said Fame. Ezra looked at Fame in the driving mirror, then he laughed.
"You heard about Harker's death on the radio, did you?" said Ezra.
"Yes," said Fame. "It's a bad business."
"A very bad business," said Ezra, and laughed again.
Fame looked out of the window. They had reached Donna. Ezra turned the car into a narrow lane. The car bumped down the lane until it came to the last house. Ezra stopped the car.
"Take him out," said Ezra to the two men, "and take him inside."
"Which room shall we put him in, boss?"
asked Robert, the fat man. This was the first time he'd spoken, and Fame recognized the voice immediately. It was the voice he'd heard in Harker's hut 2 days ago when he'd discovered Harker's body. And that's where he'd heard Guido's voice too. Now Fame remembered. Guido's voice had an Italian accent. Robert's voice was strong and deep.
"Put him in the cellar, Robert," said Ezra. "We don't want to make him too comfortable, do we?"
And Ezra laughed again. Chapter 18. Ezra's place. The cellar was not a comfortable room. It was dark and small. Guido and Robert pushed Fame inside and locked the door. Fame was alone. Hundreds of questions raced through Fame's mind as he stood in that small dark cellar. What did Ezra want? What was Ezra going to do with him? What was Zara doing? Where was Don? What was Inspector Roland doing? Where was the golden head? What did that poem mean? Fame wanted answers to all these questions. The door opened and Guido came in.
"The boss wants to see you," he said.
"Upstairs." Guido pushed Fame out of the cellar and up some stone steps. At the top of the steps was a door. Guido knocked.
"Come in,"
said a voice. Guido opened the door and pushed Fame inside. Fame found himself in a large, comfortable room. Ezra was sitting behind a large desk with his back to a large window. The window opened out onto a balcony. On the floor of the room there was a Persian carpet, and on the walls there were tall bookshelves full of books. On Ezra's desk there was a photograph. Fame saw that it was the same photograph Inspector Roland had showed him, the photograph taken at the museum reception. "Sit down," said Ezra, pointing to a chair in front of the desk. Fame sat down. Guido left the room. "Cigar?" asked Ezra, opening a box of cigars and holding the box out to Fame. "My hands are tied," said Fame. "Of course," said Ezra. "How stupid of me. Guido!" he shouted. Guido, who had been waiting outside, came in. "Untie his hands," ordered Ezra. Guido untied Fame's hands. "You may go," said Ezra to Guido. Guido left the room. "Cigar?" said Ezra again. "Thank you," said Fame, and took one. "Light?" asked Ezra, picking up a cigarette lighter from the desk and holding it out to Fame. "Thank you," said Fame, leaning forward with the cigar in his mouth. Ezra lit Fame's cigar and sat back in his chair. There was a silence while both men smoked their cigars. "Now," said Ezra after the silence, "where is it?" "Where's what?" asked Fame. "You know," said Ezra. "I don't know," said Fame. "The head," said Ezra. "Oh, the head," said Fame. "Yes," said Ezra, "the head, the golden Egyptian head from the museum." "I don't know," said Fame. "I didn't steal it." "I know," said Ezra. "I know you didn't steal it. Harker stole it, but you know where it is, don't you?" "No," said Fame, "I don't." Ezra took the cigar from his mouth and looked hard at Fame. Then he blew some smoke straight into Fame's face. "Now, Fame," he said, "don't be stupid." "I'm not being stupid," said Fame. "I've no idea where the golden head is." Ezra put his left hand into his jacket pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. He pushed it across the desk to Fame. "Have you seen that before?" asked Ezra. Yes," said Fame. It was the poem Harker had written to Fame before he was killed. "What does the poem mean?" asked Ezra. "I've no idea," said Fame. "Read it aloud," said Ezra. So Fame read the poem aloud. "Well, what does it mean?" asked Ezra again, when Fame had finished reading the poem. "I don't know," said Fame. "I don't understand it." Ezra pressed a little button on his desk. The door behind Fame opened, and Guido and Robert came in. "Tie him up again," said Ezra, pointing to Fame. Guido held Fame's hands, pulled them behind his back, and tied them with the same piece of rope. Robert knocked the cigar out of Fame's mouth. Ezra stood up and walked over to the window. He turned round and looked at Fame. "I've been gentle with you so far," said Ezra, "but I'm getting a little impatient." "But I don't know any—" began Fame. "You listen to me," said Ezra. He was suddenly angry. "Harker and I planned to steal the golden head together. We planned it. Harker wanted the golden head, and I said I'd help him steal it. We planned the robbery together. I agreed to steal the head for Harker and take it to my room in the Imperial Hotel. But we argued. Harker and I had an argument. Harker got that head by himself. He got there before me." Ezra paused and wiped his hand over his mouth. At last he was telling Fame what had really happened. Fame stared at Ezra, waiting for Ezra to continue his story. "When I discovered that Harker had stolen the head by himself," continued Ezra, "I was angry, very angry. I went to Harker's hut in the forest and we argued. He wouldn't tell me where he'd hidden the head of the pharaoh." "So you killed him," said Fame simply. "Shut up," said Ezra. "I haven't finished yet. We killed Harker, but only after we'd argued. I found this poem on Harker's desk, addressed to you. I asked him what it meant. He wouldn't tell me, but I knew it was important. I knew that there was a message hidden in the poem, about the head. Harker said that you would understand the poem. We argued. I lost my temper and we killed him." "What do you mean by we?" asked Fame.
"Well, Guido, Robert and myself, of course," said Ezra. "We killed Harker, hung him up, and then we left the hut quickly."
"Why didn't you take the poem with you?" asked Fame.
Ezra looked at Robert, who was standing behind Fame. "That fool Robert," said Ezra, "had the poem, but he must have dropped it as we were leaving. When we realised we'd lost the poem, Robert and Guido hurried back to Harker's hut to look for the piece of paper with a poem on it, but instead of finding the poem, they found you, and you escaped with the poem."
Ezra paused. He was now red in the face and breathing hard. Fame sat still in his chair, and Guido and Robert stood behind him. Outside the house, a car stopped. Fame heard the sound and realised that it was his car. Skull had returned. Then Fame spoke.
"Now you have the poem," said Fame, "why do you need me?" "We need you," said Ezra to Fame, "because you understand the poem. I'll give you one more chance to tell me what the poem means. Where is the golden head? What does the poem say?"
Fame said nothing.
"What does the poem say?" asked Ezra again.
Fame still said nothing. Then Robert hit him. Escape. Fame didn't remember afterwards how many times they hit him. He heard Ezra's voice asking the same question, but he said nothing. Ezra was very angry. He started shouting.
"Take him back to the cellar," shouted Ezra. "Leave him there for the night. Bring him back here in the morning. Take him away."
So Fame was taken out and carried down the steps to the cellar. Guido and Robert threw him inside and locked the door. For a long time, Fame lay on the cellar floor. There were several cuts on his head, and his back and shoulders ached. Fame fell asleep. It was early evening when he finally woke. With difficulty, Fame stood up and walked towards the window. His face and shoulders still ached, and there was dry blood on his shirt. But he felt quite calm, and his head was very clear. Fame thought about Ezra's story. He now knew for certain who had killed Harker and why. Ezra and his men had killed Harker, because Harker had stolen the golden head. Harker had stolen the head without telling Ezra where he'd hidden it. If Fame could understand the poem, he could learn where Harker had hidden the golden head. Fame had to learn the meaning of the poem. But first he must untie his hands and escape from Ezra. Fame looked round the cellar. In one corner there were a few broken chairs and some wooden boxes. Near the boxes was an old iron bed. Fame walked across the cellar to the bed. He knelt on the stone floor with his back to the bed. Then he moved his arms against the side of the bed until the rope around his hands was right against the sharp corner of the iron frame. Then Fame began to rub the rope against the frame, slowly at first, then faster. After about 5 minutes, the rope began to break. Fame rubbed harder, and a moment later the rope broke. His hands were free. Slowly Fame moved his arms round to the front. His fingers were so stiff that he could hardly move them, and there were deep white marks on his wrists where the ropes had been. Fame picked up one of the broken chairs and carried it over to the window. He put the chair against the wall under the window and stood rather unsteadily on it. Now he could see through the window. He was looking into a yard. In the middle of the yard was his car. Someone had mended the windscreen. Skull, the bald-headed man, was standing beside the car. It was now nearly dark. The sun had gone, and Fame could hear the evening noises beginning. Insects, children playing, and the noise of plates as someone prepared supper. Fame decided to wait until it was completely dark. He looked at the window. It was small, but it was the only way out of the cellar. The window had a wooden frame, and wire had been nailed to the frame. Fame got down from the chair and felt on the floor for a tool to pull off the wire. In the darkness, his hands felt something cold and hard. It was a large bent nail. Fame got back on the chair and looked out again. Skull had disappeared. Very gently, Fame pushed the nail under the wire and began to pull the wire away from the frame. It was slow work, but after about 1/4 of an hour, Fame had pulled one corner of the wire back from the frame. Fame worked on. It was not completely dark. There was one dim light in the yard. Someone came out of a door and crossed the yard. Fame saw his face as he passed under the light. It was Ezra. It took Fame about an hour to pull off the wire. Once he heard footsteps coming up to the cellar door, but nobody came in. Then Fame could hear laughter from one of the rooms across the yard. Ezra and his men must be having supper. When Fame had removed the wire, he put his head through the window and looked out. There was no one in the yard. He pulled his head back in and waited a moment. All was quiet. He started to go through the window, but it wasn't easy. The window was small. But Fame pushed and turned his body until at last he was through the window. He stepped out quietly into the yard. As soon as he was in the yard, Fame went to his car. He looked inside. To his surprise, Skull had left the keys in the car. Fame was about to get in, when a door opened and two men came into the yard. Fame dropped down and lay flat on the ground beside the car.
"Well now," said a voice, "I think it's time we asked our friend Fame some more questions."
It was Ezra's voice.
"Shall I go and get him, boss?"
It was Guido's voice.
"Okay," said Ezra. "Bring him up to my room."
"Right, boss,"
said Guido. Both men moved away. Fame didn't wait. He jumped into the car, turned the key to start the engine, and accelerated out of the yard. There were shouts behind him. Looking in the mirror, Fame saw that both Ezra and Guido, the Italian, were running. Fame accelerated down the narrow street. He was in a poor part of town, where all the streets were narrow and badly lit. There was no traffic, and there were few people in the streets. Fame looked in the mirror again, and saw that the big blue car was following him. Ezra was driving the blue car, and Guido was sitting beside him. Fame drove fast, but he didn't know the streets. Ezra did. Slowly the blue car came nearer to him. Fame turned his car into another sloping narrow street. Both cars were going very fast. Suddenly Fame saw that there was a wall ahead. The street had no exit. There was no way out. Fame put on the brakes to stop the car. The tires screamed on the dry road, and the car moved wildly from left to right, and then came to a stop. Fame pulled the keys out of the car and jumped out. To his left, there was an opening in the wall. Beyond it was another street. Fame ran through the opening. Chapter 18. Trapped. In front of Fame was a high wall. Behind him were Ezra and Guido. Fame could hear Ezra and Guido shouting behind him. They were following him through the opening and down the narrow street. Fame turned right suddenly and ran back down a very small path. There were no lights at all in the path, and once he fell over a broken box lying against the wall. At the end of the path there were some steps which dropped into the darkness. As Fame ran down the steps, he fell over onto the stone pavement at the bottom. By now, Ezra and Guido had reached the top of the steps. Fame couldn't see them, but he could hear them shouting to each other. Fame got up and ran on. He couldn't see anything in front of him, and there was a sharp pain in his left leg, but he had to keep going. After about another 10 meters, he suddenly saw the black shape of a wall in front of him. He saw the wall too late, and ran straight into it. Fame was trapped. There was no way that he could escape. On one side of him was a high wall, on the other side were Ezra and Guido. The wall was too high to climb, and Fame could find no door or window that led through it. He turned to face Ezra and Guido. He could hear them both breathing, only a few meters away.
"Fame, where are you?"
called Ezra.
"We're coming to get you," said Guido. "You can't escape now."
So far, Ezra and Guido hadn't seen Fame. They were both coming forward very slowly towards the wall. Fame moved a little to his left. As he did so, he felt a piece of metal in the wall. It was a door handle. Very gently, Fame turned the handle and silently opened the door. He opened the door wide enough to slip through. Then, quick as a cat, he closed the door behind him, and felt to see if there was a key. There was a large key, and Fame turned it to lock the door. He heard an angry shout from Ezra on the other side of the wall. Fame had escaped. Fame seemed to be in a garden. There was a smell of lemons, and he could just see the shape of a large bush to the left of the door. In the distance there was a light, and Fame began to move slowly towards it. He was walking on soft earth, and the smell of lemons was very strong. The light was coming from the window of a house, and Fame could see the dark shape of the building against the sky. He walked carefully on until he had reached the side of the house just below the window. There was a pile of boxes directly under the window. Fame reached up to pull himself on top of the pile so that he could look through the window. As he was pulling himself up, Fame knocked one of the boxes with his knee. The whole pile of boxes fell to the ground, and Fame fell with them. Almost immediately, Fame heard voices coming towards him. Suddenly someone shone a torch on Fame as he lay among the broken boxes. Then Fame heard a voice that he knew very well.
"Well, Mr. Fame," said the voice, "what a surprise to see you. Welcome to police headquarters."
Fame looked up from the pile of boxes on the ground. Looking down at him was Inspector Roland. Chapter 17. Plans. Fame picked himself up.
"Hello, Inspector," he said. "I've come to see you."
"So I see," said Inspector Roland. "Are you staying?"
"If you want me to," said Fame.
Inspector Roland smiled. "You're staying," said the inspector. And two policemen took Fame by the arms and led him into the police headquarters. Fame was led into a large room with a lot of maps on one wall and a very large painting of the President on the opposite wall. In the middle of the room was a long table with 8 chairs round it.
"Sit down, Fame,"
said Inspector Roland, pointing to one of the chairs. Fame sat down. So did the others. Apart from Inspector Roland, there were 3 other people in the room, 2 policemen and a woman holding a notebook.
"Well,"
said Inspector Roland cheerfully, looking at Fame.
"And where have you been?"
"Here and there," said Fame.
"Doing what?" asked the inspector.
"Thinking," said Fame.
"Did you find Harker?" asked the inspector.
"Harker's dead," said Fame.
"I know," said Inspector Roland. "Did you kill him?"
"No," said Fame, "but I know who did. Ezra. Ezra and his men killed Harker." There was a silence.
"Do you want to tell us what happened?" said the inspector.
"All right," said Fame. Fame began to tell the inspector what had happened. He told Inspector Roland about the hut in the forest, the argument between Harker and Ezra, and about Harker's plan to steal the golden head. He told the inspector how Harker had stolen the head, and how Ezra, Guido, and Robert had killed him. Inspector Roland listened to Fame's story. Then Fame told the inspector how Ezra and his men had captured him, and asked him many questions. Fame explained how it escaped from Ezra.
"I see," said Inspector Roland when Fame had finished. "Very interesting. But there's something else I'd like to know, something you haven't told me."
"What's that?" asked Fame.
"Where the head is, the golden head. Where is the golden head of the pharaoh stolen from the museum by Harker?"
"I don't know where it is," said Fame. Inspector Roland leant forward.
"Look, Fame," he said, "you're an intelligent man. I'm an intelligent man. Let's not play games."
"What do you mean?" said Fame.
"Listen," said the inspector. "I know you worked for Harker, and I know Ezra worked for Harker. Harker had a gang, didn't he?"
"Yes," said Fame.
"Now, I've been trying to catch Harker and his gang for a long time. You and he and the gang have been smuggling for years, haven't you?"
"Well," said Fame.
"Yes, you have," said the inspector. "I know you have. Well, I don't know what you've been smuggling, but if you don't help me, you and your friends are going to go to prison."
"What for?" asked Fame.
"For stealing the golden head of the pharaoh Chephren IV."
"But," began Fame, "you could never prove that we stole the head. You know we didn't steal it. I've told you that Harker stole the head."
"I think I could prove that you stole the head," said Inspector Roland. "There's a lot of evidence against you."
Fame was silent. It was true. There was a lot of evidence against him. He was Harker's most important man. He had the mysterious perm. He had had an appointment with Harker the night Harker was killed. Inspector Roland took a piece of paper off the desk and showed it to Fame. Fame immediately recognized what was written on the paper. It was Harker's poem. "Where did you get this?" asked Fame.
"From your friend," said Inspector Roland.
"Which friend?" asked Fame.
"Your girlfriend," said the inspector.
"Zara?" asked Fame, amazed.
"Zara,"
said the inspector. As he spoke, the inspector picked up a small silver bell from the table and rang it. Almost immediately the door opened, and Zara and Don came in, followed by a policeman. Chapter The Poem. "Zara," said Fame. "Hello, Fame," said Zara.
"Hello, Fame," said Don.
"Hello, Don," said Fame.
"Well," said Inspector Roland, "now you've all met, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to leave you in this room with 2 of my men to guard you, and," he held up Harker's perm, "with this piece of paper. Now, I'll give you until morning to tell me the meaning of this poem. If you work it out, and tell me where the golden head is hidden, you'll be free. If you don't work it out, you'll be charged with stealing the golden head of the Pharaoh Chephren IV.
"But we didn't steal it," said Zara.
"There's a lot of evidence against you," said Inspector Roland, smiling.
Then he left the room while the 2 policemen stayed behind. Zara, Fame, and Don looked at each other. "Well," said Zara, "let's have a look at the poem." Fame picked up the piece of paper. Fame read it out. "Great men do not walk easy roads. Tall men strain under heavy loads. They bend beneath the weight, get tired beneath the load. They go in pain and hate. They wander down that road, but then against the wall they stand, and near one rock they rest their hand." When Fame had read the poem, he looked at Don and Zara. "Well?" he asked.
"Well, it's nonsense," said Don. "Doesn't mean anything."
"It's a poem," said Zara. "It means a lot."
"Well, it's more than a poem," said Fame. "There's a message in it." "What message?" asked Don.
"I don't know," said Fame. "Well, let's try and find out." "How?" asked Zara. "Well," said Fame, "let's look at the letters at the beginning of each line." Fame took another piece of paper from his pocket and wrote down the letters at the beginning of each line. G, D, T, S, T, G, T, T, B, A.
"What does that spell?" asked Don.
"Nothing," said Zara. "Let's try the letters the other way round," said Fame.
"How do you mean?"
said Don.
"Like this,"
said Fame, and he wrote the letters down backwards. A, B, T, T, G, T, S, T, D, G.
"What does that spell?" asked Don.
"Nothing," said Zara. "OK," said Fame, "let's try something else. Let's take the first letter of the first line and the last letter of the second line, and so on."
"How do you mean?" asked Don.
"Like this," said Fame, and he wrote down GST, STD, TD, BD.
"What does that spell?" asked Don.
"Nothing," said Zara. "Try the letters the other way round," said Fame. And this time Don wrote them down. DB, DT, DTS, TSG. "It still doesn't spell anything," said Zara.
"I know," said Fame. "It's nonsense," said Don.
Fame shook his head. The 2 policemen were watching them from the other end of the room. "I've got an idea," said Zara suddenly.
"What is it?"
asked Fame. "Take the first letter of the first line, and the second letter of the second line, and so on."
"How do you mean?" asked Don.
"Like this," said Zara. "Fame, what's the first letter of the first line?"
"G,"
said Fame. "And the second letter of the second line?" asked Zara. O, said Fame. And the third letter of the third line? L. And the fourth letter of the fourth line? A. And the fifth letter of the fifth line? B. And the sixth letter of the sixth line? R. And the seventh letter of the seventh line? I. And the eighth letter of the eighth line? D, said Fame. And the ninth letter of the ninth line? G. And the 10th letter of the 10th line? E, said Fame. What does that spell? Asked Don. He was laughing. Let's see, said Fame. Golabridge. Fame looked at Zara. She was looking at Fame. She was going to shout, but Fame stopped Zara from shouting. They had discovered the message hidden in the poem, but Fame didn't want the policeman to know. Fame made a sign. "Oh dear, it doesn't spell anything," he said loudly. He looked at the two policemen. They weren't even looking. "Golabridge," whispered Zara. "So that's the message in the poem." "Golabridge?" whispered Don. "Of course, the bridge over the river Gola, not far from my hideout." "So that's where the head's hidden," whispered Fame. Fame looked at the policeman again. One of them was looking out of the window, and the other was yawning. Fame looked at Zara. Zara nodded. She understood what Fame wanted to do next. She coughed. The two policemen looked at her. "Excuse me," said Zara. "What do you want?" asked one of the policemen. "I'd like a drink of water," said Zara. "I'm thirsty." "All right," said the policeman. "I'll get you a drink of water." And he went out of the room to get a glass of water for Zara. There was now only one policeman in the room. "Excuse me," said Fame to the policeman. "What do you want?" said the policeman. "We want some help," said Fame. "What with?" asked the policeman. "This poem," said Fame. "What's the difficulty?" asked the policeman, coming over to Fame. "Is this letter a G or a Y?" asked Fame. The policeman bent over the bit of paper. Very quickly, Don moved behind the policeman and hit him hard on the back of the head with his open hand. The policeman fell onto the floor. "Quick!" said Don. "The other policeman will be back soon." Don stood behind the door, and Fame and Zara stood in front of the fallen policeman. The door opened, and the other policeman came in, carrying a glass of water. "I've brought you your—" said the policeman, but he didn't finish the sentence. Don held him from behind and hit him. The glass dropped onto the carpet. Don caught the policeman as he fell. "Into the garden," said Fame to Don and Zara. They opened the door into the garden and went out. Behind them, on the table, lay the piece of paper with Golabridge written on it. Chapter The Search. Fame led Zara and Don back through the garden to the door in the wall and out into the street. They walked back quietly to where Fame had left his car. The moon had come up, lighting the paths and the streets. There was no sign of Ezra or Guido. There was no sign of their car either, but Fame's car was still there. Zara, Don and Fame got into the car quickly. Fame backed the car up the narrow street, turned and drove out of Donna. Zara and Don didn't ask where they were going. They knew where they were going. The moon was shining brightly, and it was a warm night. Fame drove fast through the empty streets and into the country. They passed the turn to Don's hideout, and then Fame turned the car off the main road and down a lane. After about 2 kilometres, they heard the sound of running water. It was the sound of the Gola River running down to Lake Donna. Fame stopped the car before the bridge, and the three of them looked out. They could see the huge black shape of the Gola Bridge in front of them. Above them, on one side of the road, was a steep hill. On the other side was a steep drop down to the river. "We're here," said Fame. They looked at the bridge. "Where do we begin the search?" asked Zara. "The bridge is so big." "I don't think the head is hidden on the bridge at all," said Fame.
Where is it hidden, then? Asked Don.
Look at the perm again, said Fame. He took the perm out of his pocket. Then he got a torch from the car and switched it on. They all looked at the perm. Right, said Fame. Listen. Zara discovered the most important thing, the words Gola Bridge. But the bridge is very big, and there's nowhere very safe to hide the head. I think the head is somewhere very near the bridge. Now, there are some clues in the perm. Listen. Great men do not walk easy roads.
What does that mean? Asked Don.
You know the old quarry up there on the hillside, don't you? Asked Fame.
Of course I do, replied Don. My father used to work in the quarry.
Well, said Fame, the path to the quarry is rough and difficult, isn't it?
Yes, it is, Don agreed.
And the workers who went up and down to the quarry carried heavy loads, didn't they? Asked Fame. That's in the fourth line of the poem. Strain under heavy loads. Then the Pharaoh's head must be hidden in the quarry, said Zara. Yes, it must be hidden very near the quarry, replied Fame. But listen to the last two lines of the poem. There are two more clues in the poem. But then against the wall they stand, and near one rock they rest their hand. Fame looked up at the others. They were all silent for a moment, and then Don shouted out.
I know what the last two lines of the poem mean, he shouted. The wall is the wall of the quarry. When you get to the quarry, you come to the quarry wall, don't you?
Yes, you do, said Zara.
And next to the quarry wall there is a large rock, said Don. In the rock there's a small cave.
Don looked at Zara and then at Fame. They all smiled. So the Pharaoh's head was hidden in the rock, next to the quarry wall. They got out of the car and walked up the narrow path to the quarry. The moon threw the shadows of the bushes across the path. It was very quiet. When they got to the quarry, they walked to the quarry wall. They could see the shape of a large rock by the wall.
Come on,
said Fame, and began to climb up the side of the rock. Don and Zara followed him. The rock was quite easy to climb. Near the top of the rock was a small cave. Fame flashed the torch in the darkness. Something shone. Fame ran forward and picked up something. It was the golden head of the Pharaoh.
What are you going to do with it? Asked Don.
Send it to Inspector Roland, of course, said Fame. He wants the head. We don't want it. We just want to continue with our usual business. Yes, we'll send the head to Inspector Roland.
Oh, no, you won't, said a voice.
It was Ezra, standing just below the rock with a gun in his hand. With him were Guido the Italian, Fat Robert, and Skull. They all had guns. Shot dead.
Come down,
said Ezra. Fame, Zara, and Don came down, carrying the head.
I'll take that,
said Ezra, pointing to the golden head. Fame gave the head to Ezra, and Ezra smiled. At last, said Ezra.
Very clever, said Fame.
Yes, it was quite clever, wasn't it, said Ezra. We simply followed you here. How? Asked Fame.
I knew you'd come back to your car,
said Ezra. We simply waited round the corner until you did come back. Then we drove behind you, parked the car a little way from the bridge, and walked. We could hear you up by the quarry, so we followed you up the quarry path. And now here you are, said Fame. Exactly, said Ezra. What are you going to do with us? Asked Fame.
Well, said Ezra, we don't really need you any more, so I think we'll send you on a journey.
A journey? Asked Don. Yes, said Ezra. Come with us. He pointed with his gun to the path from the quarry down to the road. That way, he said. So Fame, Don, and Zara walked back down the path, followed by Ezra and his men with their guns. When they reached the road, Fame's car was still parked on the road facing the bridge. Ezra whispered something to Guido. Guido got into Fame's car and turned it across the road. Fame's car now faced the edge of the slope that dropped steeply down to the river.
"Now," said Ezra, "you three are all going to get into your car, and then you, Fame, are going to drive it over the slope and into the river. I hope you can swim, because if not, there'll be a little accident."
Ezra smiled. The Italian smiled. Robert smiled. Even Skull smiled. Fame, Zara, and Don didn't smile.
"Come on," said Ezra. "Get into the car."
Fame opened the door slowly. "Why don't you let us go?" he asked Ezra.
"Because I don't like you," said Ezra. "Get in!"
Fame got into his car, and so did Zara and Don. In front of them was the steep drop down to the river.
"Now start the car," said Ezra.
Fame started the car. Below them lay the river. The moon was reflected in the river.
"Goodbye," said Ezra, waving at them and smiling. "Have a safe—"
But Ezra never finished his sentence. Suddenly there was the sound of a gun up the lane. Ezra stood with his mouth open and one arm in the air. Then he turned slowly and fell. Fame looked down the lane and saw 3 men running towards the car. Fame recognized the man who was carrying the gun. It was Inspector Roland. Fame did not wait. He turned his car back onto the road and accelerated towards the bridge. Inspector Roland saw the car race across the Gola Bridge and disappear. The inspector bent down beside the body of Ezra and quietly picked up the golden head of the Pharaoh Chephren IV. His men were taking away Guido, Robert, and Skull.
"Well," said the inspector to the Pharaoh, "welcome back."
Chapter 21. A long time later. It was 5 years later. Chief Inspector Roland was abroad, on holiday. He was staying in a small fishing town beside the sea. One evening, he was sitting at a cafe table on the pavement, drinking a cup of coffee and smoking a cigarette. He leaned back and blew a puff of cigarette smoke into the sky. It was a beautiful warm night with a full moon. The sky was full of stars. He felt very happy. Inspector Roland shut his eyes.
"Inspector Roland," said a voice.
The inspector opened his eyes. Someone was calling him. Standing on the other side of the cafe table was John Samuel Fame. There was a woman beside him. It was Zara. Inspector Roland stood up.
"Fame," he said, "and Zara."
"Hello, Inspector," said Zara.
"Sit down," said Inspector Roland. "Please, sit down."
So Fame and Zara sat down, and Inspector Roland ordered 2 more coffees, and they talked. They talked for a long time, into the early morning, like old friends. Inspector Roland told them about the golden head, which was now safe in the Donna Museum, and about Guido and Robert and Skull, just out of prison and now leading honest lives. The inspector told them about Harker and Ezra, buried side by side in the hill cemetery above Donna. Fame and Zara told the inspector about their marriage, about their 2 children, about their house and garden, and their happiness together. It was 1 o'clock in the morning when Fame looked at his watch.
"We must go," he said to Zara.
I'm tired." They both stood up.
"Goodbye, Inspector," said Fame, shaking hands. "It's been wonderful meeting you again."
"I've enjoyed it," said the inspector, smiling.
"Goodbye, Zara."
"Goodbye, Inspector," said Zara, and she smiled. They turned and started to walk down the street. Inspector Roland watched them. Then he remembered.
"Fame!"
he shouted. Fame stopped and turned.
"Yes?"
he said.
"One question," said the inspector. "What were you smuggling all those years, when you worked for Harker?"
There was a silence. Fame looked at Zara. She nodded. Fame turned to the inspector again.
"Cars," he said.
The inspector stood with his mouth open.
"Cars?"
he said, amazed. Yes, said Fame. Cars. But, said the inspector, you only had one car. That's what you thought, said Fame, smiling. You mean that every time you crossed the frontier, you were driving a different car? Asked the inspector. That's right, said Fame. The number plate was always the same, and the colour and type of car was always the same, but it was a different car each time. But how... said the inspector. Why... He was speechless. Very simple, said Fame. On my side of the frontier, we made cars. On your side of the frontier, you needed cars. On my side of the frontier, cars were cheap. On your side of the frontier, cars were expensive. So, I drove a new car from my country into your country. I told the customs it was my car. When I got to Don's hideout, Don took the new car. Then he gave me a second-hand car, same colour, same type as the new car, and I drove back to my country. Each time I came into your country, I was in a new car, but the car's number was the same. So we made a lot of money. We paid no tax, and we sold the new cars for a good price. And nobody guessed. You all looked inside the car. You didn't look at the car itself. There was a silence. Well, said the inspector, I don't know what to say. Say nothing, said Fame. It was all a long time ago. And turning, Fame took Zara by the hand and walked away.